Margaret wiped the sweat from her forehead as she carefully dusted the expensive crystal vases in Mr. Harrison's living room. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of the luxury mansion, highlighting every surface she had already cleaned. At 6 months pregnant, every movement required extra effort, but she needed this job more than ever. Robert Harrison sat behind his mahogany desk in his home office, talking loudly on his phone about another business deal. His voice carried through the house as he bragged about buying out a small family restaurant chain. Margaret had worked for the Harrison family for 3 years, and she knew her employer well. He was a man who believed money could solve any problem and that people were disposable. The Harrison mansion stood on 5 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. Robert had made his fortune in real estate development, often buying struggling businesses and properties for far less than their worth. His wife, Patricia, spent most of her time at charity events, more interested in being photographed than actually helping people. Margaret lived in a small apartment across town with her husband, David, who worked double shifts at a local factory. When they discovered they were expecting their first child, Margaret knew she would need to work as long as possible to save money for the baby. The Harrisons paid well, and she had hoped to work until her 8th month of pregnancy. As she moved to clean the fireplace mantel, Margaret felt a sharp pain in her lower back. She paused, placing one hand on her growing belly and the other on the mantel for support. The baby had been active all morning, and the physical demands of cleaning the large house were becoming more challenging each day. Robert appeared in the doorway, his expensive suit perfectly pressed and his silver hair slicked back. He looked at Margaret with the same expression he might give to a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. His cold blue eyes showed no warmth or understanding. "Margaret, I need to speak with you," he said, his voice sharp and businesslike. "Come to my office when you finish this room." Margaret nodded, a knot forming in her stomach. In 3 years of working for the Harrisons, she had never been called to his office unless something was wrong. She quickly finished dusting and made her way down the long hallway lined with expensive paintings and photographs of the Harrison family at various social events. The office smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Robert sat behind his desk, not bothering to look up from his computer screen as Margaret entered. She stood quietly, waiting for him to speak, her hands folded over her pregnant belly. "I've been thinking about the efficiency of this household," Robert began, still typing on his keyboard. "With Patricia's social schedule increasing and my business expanding, we need staff who can keep up with our demands." Margaret felt her heart begin to race. She had always been punctual, thorough, and respectful. The other staff members often commented on how hard she worked, even while pregnant. "I understand, Mr. Harrison. If there's anything I can do better, please let me know," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. Robert finally looked up, his expression cold and calculating. "The problem isn't your work quality, Margaret. It's your condition. A pregnant woman simply cannot maintain the standards this household requires. You move too slowly, you need more breaks, and frankly, it's becoming a liability." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had been working just as hard as always, perhaps even harder to prove she could handle the job while pregnant. "Sir, I've never missed a day of work. I complete all my tasks and I—" "This isn't a negotiation," Robert interrupted, raising his hand to silence her. "I've made my decision. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Harrison, please. My husband and I are depending on this income. The baby is due in 3 months, and we've been saving every penny. If you could just give me a chance to—" "I said this isn't a negotiation." Robert's voice grew louder, his face reddening with annoyance. "I don't run a charity, Margaret. I run a business, and that includes this household. Pregnant women are unreliable, and I won't have my home's maintenance compromised because you're having a baby." Tears began to form in Margaret's eyes, but she fought to keep her composure. "What about the law? Don't I have some protection as a pregnant employee? Robert laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the large office. You're domestic help, not a corporate employee. Besides, I have the best lawyers money can buy. You'd never be able to afford to fight me, and we both know it. The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just a business decision for him. He was enjoying her distress. Margaret realized that to Robert Harrison, she was nothing more than an inconvenience to be discarded. I'll give you 1 week's severance pay, which is more generous than I need to be, Robert continued, opening his desk drawer and pulling out his checkbook. Consider it my contribution to your little family situation. As he wrote the check, Margaret stood frozen, trying to process what was happening. In a matter of minutes, her family's financial security had crumbled. The medical bills, the baby, preparations, the rent, everything they had planned for was now in jeopardy. Robert tore the check from the book and held it out to her. Clean out your locker and leave your key with Patricia. I trust you can find your way out. Margaret took the check with trembling hands, noticing that he had made it out for exactly 1 week's pay, the legal minimum. No bonus for 3 years. Of faithful service, no consideration for her circumstances, no human decency. As she walked toward the door, Robert had already turned back to his computer, dismissing her completely. Margaret paused at the threshold, looking back at the man who had just destroyed her family's future without a second thought. I hope you never find yourself in need of someone else's kindness, Mr. Harrison, she said quietly. Robert didn't even look up. I won't. That's what money is for. Margaret left the mansion that day, not knowing that her quiet words would prove to be prophetic, and that Robert Harrison's world was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. Margaret sat in her small kitchen that evening, staring at the termination check while David paced back and forth behind her. The single week's pay felt like an insult after 3 years of dedicated service. Their small apartment suddenly felt even smaller as the weight of their situation pressed down on them. He can't just fire you for being pregnant, David said, his voice tight with anger. There have to be laws against this kind of thing. Margaret looked up at her husband, seeing the worry lines that had appeared around his eyes since she had told him the news. David worked 60 hours a week at the factory, but his income alone wouldn't cover their rent, utilities, groceries, and the mounting medical bills from her pregnancy. He said I was just domestic help, not a real employee, Margaret replied, her voice hollow. And he was right about one thing. We can't afford to fight someone like Robert Harrison. He has more money for lawyers than we have for everything else combined. The next morning, Margaret began the humiliating process of looking for work while 6 months pregnant. She visited cleaning services, applied for retail positions, and even inquired about office work, despite having no experience. Every interview ended the same way. Polite interest until they noticed her condition, then sudden concerns about scheduling and availability. Meanwhile, Robert Harrison continued his daily routine without giving Margaret a second thought. He attended board meetings, played golf at his exclusive country club, and made plans for expanding his real estate empire. Patricia had hired a new maid within 2 days, a young woman named Sophia who worked quickly and efficiently without any inconvenient personal circumstances. At the country club, Robert bragged to his wealthy friends about his business philosophy. You have to be ruthless in this world, he said, swirling his expensive whiskey. The moment you start making exceptions for people's personal problems, you lose control. I had a maid who thought pregnancy gave her special privileges. Had to let her go, of course. His friends nodded in approval, sharing their own stories of difficult employees and the importance of maintaining authority. None of them questioned whether Robert's actions were legal or moral. In their world, money and power made their own rules. Back in her apartment, Margaret discovered that finding new employment while visibly pregnant was nearly impossible. The few employers who showed interest offered wages far below what she had earned at the Harrison mansion. One cleaning service offered her work that would pay less than half her previous salary, with no benefits and no job security. David picked up extra shifts at the factory, but the additional income barely made up for a third of what Margaret had been earning. They began making difficult choices, buying generic groceries, canceling their cable subscription, and postponing purchases for the baby. 2 weeks after losing her job, Margaret received a call from her doctor's office. She had missed her last appointment due to a job interview, and they were calling to reschedule. When Margaret explained that she was between jobs and asked about payment options, the receptionist's tone became noticeably cooler. "We'll need to discuss payment arrangements before your next visit," the receptionist said. "Perhaps you should look into public assistance programs." The suggestion stung, even though Margaret knew it might be necessary. She had always been proud of supporting herself and contributing to her family's income. The idea of depending on government assistance felt like another defeat in an already overwhelming situation. As Margaret struggled to find work, Robert Harrison's business continued to thrive. He closed a major deal to develop a shopping center on land he had acquired from a struggling family farm. The family had been forced to sell due to medical bills from the elderly father's cancer treatment, exactly the kind of desperate situation Robert specialized in exploiting. Patricia Harrison remained blissfully unaware of her husband's treatment of Margaret. She spent her days planning charity luncheons and shopping for designer clothes, secure in the bubble of wealth that insulated her from other people's struggles. When friends asked about their household staff, she mentioned that they had made some changes, but never inquired about the details. 3 weeks after losing her job, Margaret finally found part-time work at a small grocery store. The manager, Mrs. Chen, was a kind woman who understood Margaret's situation and was willing to work around her pregnancy limitations. However, the job paid minimum wage and offered only 20 hours per week, barely enough to cover their basic expenses. Margaret's new routine was exhausting. She worked early morning shifts at the grocery store, then spent her afternoons applying for additional work or attending job interviews. The stress was taking a toll on her health, and David worried constantly about the effects on both Margaret and their unborn child. One evening, as Margaret sorted through a stack of rejection letters, she found herself thinking about Robert Harrison. She wondered if he ever considered the consequences of his actions beyond his immediate convenience. Did he know that his decision had put a pregnant woman and her family in financial jeopardy? Did he care? The answer, Margaret realized, was probably no. Men like Robert Harrison lived in a world where other people's suffering was an abstraction, something that happened to someone else, somewhere else. They made decisions based on profit and convenience, never seeing the human faces behind the numbers. What Margaret didn't know was that Robert Harrison's seemingly untouchable world was about to face its own crisis. The real estate market was showing signs of instability, and several of his major investments were based on risky financial instruments that he didn't fully understand. His accountant had been trying to schedule a meeting to discuss some concerning trends, but Robert had been too busy celebrating his recent successes to pay attention to warning signs. As Margaret struggled to make ends meet on her new minimum wage, job forces were already in motion that would soon challenge Robert Harrison's assumption that money and power could protect him from every consequence. The universe, it seemed, was preparing to teach him a lesson about the interconnectedness of all people's fortunes. But for now, Margaret could only focus on surviving each day, protecting her unborn child, and maintaining hope that somehow things would get better. She had no way of knowing that her former employer's reckoning was already beginning. 4 weeks had passed since Margaret lost her job, and the financial strain was becoming unbearable. Despite working at the grocery store and David taking on extra factory shifts, they were falling behind on bills, their savings carefully accumulated. For the baby's arrival had been depleted paying for rent and basic necessities. Margaret's pregnancy was becoming more challenging as she entered her 7th month. The long hours on her feet at the grocery store caused swelling in her ankles, and the stress of their financial situation kept her awake at night. Mrs. Chen, her sympathetic manager, noticed Margaret struggling and offered her a chair during slower periods, but Margaret felt guilty accepting help when she needed to prove her worth. Meanwhile, Robert Harrison was facing the first cracks in his seemingly perfect world, though he hadn't recognized them yet. His accountant, Michael Stevens, had been leaving increasingly urgent messages about irregularities in several investment accounts. Robert's business partner in the shopping center development had been asking difficult questions about funding sources, and two major tenants had unexpectedly withdrawn from lease agreements. Robert dismissed these concerns as minor setbacks. In his experience, money could solve any problem, and he had plenty of money. He authorized bonuses for himself and Patricia, purchased a new luxury car, and booked an expensive vacation to celebrate his recent successes. The idea that his business empire might be vulnerable never crossed his mind. The first real warning came during a routine meeting with his bank's investment advisor. James Morrison, a serious man who had managed the Harrison family's investments for over a decade, spread several documents across the conference table with obvious concern. "Robert, we need to discuss some significant issues with your portfolio," Morrison began, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by professional worry. "Several of your high-yield investments are showing signs of serious instability." Robert waved dismissively. "Market fluctuations are normal, James. You worry too much. My net worth has only gone up for the past 5 years." "That's exactly the problem," Morrison replied, pointing to a complex chart showing Robert's investment distribution. "You've been borrowing against your properties to fund increasingly risky ventures. Your debt-to-asset ratio has reached a dangerous level." Robert's attention was already wandering. Through the conference room window, he could see the bustling city where he owned several prominent buildings. The idea that his financial foundation might be shaky seemed impossible when surrounded by such visible evidence of his success. "Look, James, I appreciate your caution, but I didn't get rich by playing it safe," Robert said, standing to leave. "These investments will pay off big, just like they always have." Morrison tried once more to explain the severity of the situation. "Robert, if even 2 of these major investments fail, you could lose everything. We should consider diversifying immediately and reducing your debt exposure." But Robert was already at the door, dismissing the warning with characteristic arrogance. "I didn't build this empire by listening to pessimists. Keep doing what you're doing and let me worry about the big picture." That same day, Margaret received devastating news during a routine prenatal appointment. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been monitoring her pregnancy since the beginning, reviewed her latest test results with obvious concern. "Margaret, your blood pressure is elevated and you're showing early signs of preeclampsia," Dr. Rodriguez explained gently. "This condition can be serious for both you and the baby if not carefully managed." Margaret felt her world tilt. "What does that mean? Is the baby okay?" "The baby is fine for now, but you'll need to be monitored much more closely. I'm recommending immediate bed rest and weekly appointments. Any stress or physical strain could worsen the condition rapidly." The irony was crushing. Margaret needed to work more than ever to cover the increasing medical expenses, but her doctor was ordering her to stop working entirely. She thought about Mrs. Chen's kindness at the grocery store and realized she would have to give up even that small income. "Doctor, I can't afford to stop working," Margaret said, tears forming in her eyes. "We're already behind on bills, and now with more medical visits." Dr. Rodriguez had seen this situation too many times. Patients caught between their health, needs, and financial reality. "Margaret, I understand your situation, but preeclampsia can progress quickly. If it gets worse, you could face serious complications, including premature delivery or worse." Margaret left the doctor's office feeling more desperate than ever. She called David from the parking lot, struggling to explain the situation between sobs. David left work immediately to meet her, his own fear evident as he tried to comfort his wife while processing the implications of her diagnosis. That evening, they sat at their small kitchen table surrounded by medical bills, past due notices, and information about preeclampsia that Dr. Rodriguez had given them. The recommended treatment plan included expensive medications, frequent monitoring, and complete work cessation. Everything their financial situation made impossible. "Maybe I should try to contact Mr. Harrison," Margaret said quietly. "Explain the situation? Ask if there's any way—" David's jaw tightened. "That man threw you away like garbage when you needed understanding. He's not suddenly going to develop a conscience." Margaret knew David was right, but desperation was making her consider options that logic rejected. She thought about Patricia Harrison, wondering if the woman even knew how her husband had treated a pregnant employee. Perhaps if she could reach Patricia directly, unknown to Margaret, Patricia Harrison was at that moment hosting a charity luncheon focused on supporting expectant mothers in need. The irony would have been crushing if Margaret had known that her former employer's wife was accepting praise for her compassion, while Margaret struggled with pregnancy complications caused partly by the stress of losing her job. As Margaret contemplated, swallowing her pride to ask for help from people who had already demonstrated their callousness, Robert Harrison was about to receive news that would begin dismantling his carefully constructed world. His phone rang just as he was preparing for another celebration dinner, and the caller ID showed his business partner's name. "Robert, we have a serious problem," came the tense voice of his partner. "The shopping center project is falling apart. 3 more tenants have backed out, and the construction company is demanding payment for work already completed. We're looking at a massive loss." For the first time in years, Robert felt a flutter of uncertainty, but his confidence quickly reasserted itself. "We'll find new tenants. This is just a temporary setback." "It's not that simple," his partner continued. "The entire retail market in that area is collapsing. The anchor tenant that made the whole project viable has filed for bankruptcy. We're not going to recover the investment, Robert. We're going to lose everything we put into this." As Robert processed this information, he had no way of knowing that the financial crisis beginning to engulf his business empire was connected to the same economic pressures that had driven Margaret to seek employment during her pregnancy, and that had now forced her into an impossible choice between her health and her family's survival. The wheels of consequence were turning, but neither Robert nor Margaret could see how their fates remained intertwined. The news about the shopping center was just the beginning of Robert Harrison's problems. Within a week, his seemingly solid business empire began crumbling like a house of cards. The bankruptcy of the anchor tenant created a domino effect that exposed the dangerous interconnectedness of his investments. Robert paced in his home office, surrounded by urgent documents and legal notices. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. The phone rang constantly with calls from creditors, lawyers, and panicked business partners. "This can't be happening," Robert muttered to himself, staring at a foreclosure notice for one of his office buildings. The property had been used as collateral for the shopping center investment, and now the bank was demanding immediate payment of the full loan amount. His accountant, Michael Stevens, sat across from the desk with a grim expression. "I tried to warn you about the risk concentration, Robert. When you borrow against one property to fund another investment and then use that investment as collateral for a third deal, you create a chain reaction waiting to happen." Robert's face flushed with anger and desperation. "Don't lecture me now, Michael. Just fix it. Restructure the loans, negotiate with the banks, do whatever you have to do." Michael shook his head slowly. "It's beyond restructuring now. You owe $14 million in immediate payments across various loans. Your liquid assets total less than $2 million. Unless you can sell properties quickly, you're looking at total bankruptcy." The word bankruptcy hit Robert like a physical blow. In his world, bankruptcy wasn't just financial failure. It was social death. His reputation, his standing in the community, his entire identity was built on being the successful businessman who never lost. Meanwhile, Margaret was experiencing her own crisis. Following doctor's orders, she had reluctantly quit her job at the grocery store, leaving her family with only David's factory income. Her preeclampsia was worsening, requiring twice-weekly medical visits and expensive monitoring equipment. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store had surprised Margaret with a small collection taken up by the other employees, mostly minimum wage workers, who could barely afford to help anyone else. The gesture moved Margaret to tears, highlighting the contrast between the kindness of people with little and the cruelty of those with much. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Harrison," Margaret told David, as they reviewed their mounting medical bills. "She seemed like a nice person when I worked there. Maybe if I explained about the baby's health problems." David looked up from the bills, his face worn with exhaustion from working double shifts. "Margaret, you're talking about the wife of a man who fired you for being pregnant. What makes you think she would care now?" Margaret knew David was right, but desperation was making her consider every possible option. She thought about the charity events Patricia Harrison attended, wondering how someone could claim to care about helping people while ignoring the suffering happening in her own household. What Margaret didn't know was that Patricia Harrison was beginning to discover uncomfortable truths about her husband's business practices. As Robert's financial empire collapsed, details about his methods were coming to light. Patricia was learning about the family farms foreclosed on for medical debts, the small businesses bought for pennies on the dollar from desperate owners, and the pattern of taking advantage of people's most vulnerable moments. The revelation came during a tense conversation between Robert and Patricia in their luxury kitchen. Robert was trying to explain why they needed to immediately cut household expenses, sell Patricia's jewelry, and cancel their upcoming vacation. "I don't understand," Patricia said, her voice rising with confusion and fear. "Last month you said business was better than ever. How can we suddenly be broke?" Robert slammed his hand on the marble counter. "We're not broke. This is just a temporary cash flow problem. But we need to liquidate some assets quickly." Patricia stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in their marriage. "Robert, tell me the truth. How did you make all this money? I've heard rumors about your business methods, but I never wanted to believe them." The question hung in the air between them. Robert's success had been built on exploiting other people's desperation, buying low from families facing foreclosure, and showing no mercy to those who couldn't keep up with his demands. But he had never admitted this to Patricia, preferring to let her believe in a sanitized version of his achievements. "I did what I had to do to build this life for us," Robert said finally, his voice defensive. "Business isn't a charity. If I didn't take those opportunities, someone else would have." Patricia's face went pale as the implications sank in. "What? About our employees? The people who work for us? What happens to them if we lose everything?" Robert's response was immediate and revealing. "Staff are expendable. We'll let them go and downsize. They can find other jobs." The casual cruelty in his voice shocked Patricia. She thought about Sophia, their current maid, and suddenly wondered what had happened to Margaret, the pregnant woman who had worked for them for years, before mysteriously disappearing. "What happened to Margaret?" Patricia asked quietly. "She was with us for 3 years, and then suddenly she was gone. You said she found a better position." Robert's expression shifted, revealing his discomfort with the question. "Margaret's situation became incompatible with our needs. I had to make a business decision." The euphemism didn't fool Patricia. "You fired her for being pregnant, didn't you?" Robert's silence was answer enough. Patricia felt sick as she realized that while she had been hosting charity events for expectant mothers, her own husband had thrown a pregnant employee out of work without regard for her welfare. As Patricia grappled with the moral implications of her husband's actions, Margaret was facing a medical emergency. During a routine prenatal visit, Dr. Rodriguez discovered that her blood pressure had spiked, dangerously high, requiring immediate hospitalization. "We need to deliver the baby now," Dr. Rodriguez explained as Margaret was wheeled into the maternity ward. "The preeclampsia is threatening both your lives." David held Margaret's hand as they prepared for an emergency cesarean section at 34 weeks, 6 weeks earlier than planned. The premature delivery would require the baby to spend weeks in the neonatal intensive care unit, adding tens of thousands of dollars to their already overwhelming medical debt. "Everything will be okay," David whispered to Margaret, though his own fear was evident. "We'll figure out the money somehow." As Margaret was prepared for surgery, she couldn't help thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. The stress of losing her job, the financial pressure, the inability to follow proper medical care, all of it traceable back to Robert Harrison's decision to fire her for the crime of being pregnant. Neither Margaret nor Robert knew that their stories were about to intersect again in a way that would force both of them to confront the true cost of actions driven by greed versus those motivated by compassion. The universe was preparing to demonstrate that what goes around truly does come around, often in ways that no one could predict or prepare for. Margaret's son was born weighing just 4 pounds, his tiny body requiring immediate intensive care. As she recovered from surgery, Margaret could only see baby James through the window of the neonatal intensive care unit, connected to machines that beeped and hummed around the clock. Each day in the NICU would cost more than Margaret used to earn in a month. David sat beside Margaret's hospital bed, holding a stack of medical bills and insurance documents. The numbers were staggering. Over $50,000 for the premature delivery and ongoing neonatal care, with their basic insurance covering less than half the costs. "The social worker wants to meet with us tomorrow," David said quietly, trying not to let his despair show. "She says there might be programs that can help, but we'll have to qualify based on income and assets." Margaret nodded weakly, still recovering from the surgery and emotional trauma of seeing her newborn son fighting for his life. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now exactly where Robert Harrison had assumed she belonged, dependent on charity and government assistance. Meanwhile, Robert Harrison's world was collapsing even faster than expected. The foreclosure notices had multiplied. Creditors were demanding immediate payment, and his business partners were distancing themselves as news of his financial troubles spread through the business community. Patricia Harrison stood in their walk-in closet, packing jewelry and designer clothes into boxes. The items would be sold to raise cash, though their combined value wouldn't come close to covering Robert's debts. The woman who had once hosted charity events was now learning what it meant to lose everything. "The bank is seizing the house next." "Weak," Robert said from the doorway, his voice hollow with defeat. "We need to be out by Friday." Patricia looked up from her packing, seeing a man she barely recognized. The confident, arrogant businessman had been replaced by someone desperate and broken. "Where will we go?" Robert ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that had become habitual as his stress mounted. "I found a small apartment across town. It's all we can afford with what's left." The apartment Robert had secured was in the same neighborhood where Margaret and David lived, though neither family knew of this coincidence yet. The irony of the situation was profound. Robert Harrison, who had fired Margaret for being an inconvenience, was about to experience firsthand the kind of financial desperation he had inflicted on others. As the Harrison family prepared to lose their mansion, Patricia made a decision that would change everything. She had been carrying the guilt of Margaret's firing for days, and the stress of their own situation had made her realize how devastating sudden job loss could be. "I need to find Margaret," Patricia told Robert as they packed his office. "I need to know what happened to her after you fired her." Robert looked up sharply. "Why? What's done is done. We have our own problems now." Patricia's voice was firm with newfound resolve. "Because it matters, Robert. because I'm finally understanding what kind of man I married, and I need to try to make some of it right. Patricia hired a private investigator with some of her remaining personal funds. Within 2 days, she learned that Margaret was in the hospital, that her baby had been born prematurely, and that the family was facing catastrophic medical debt. The investigator's report included details about Margaret's job search after being fired, her diagnosis with preeclampsia, and the financial stress that had likely contributed to the premature birth. Reading the report, Patricia felt sick with guilt and responsibility. While she had been planning charity luncheons, a woman who had worked faithfully in her home was struggling with a high-risk pregnancy made worse by financial stress. The connection between Robert's actions and Margaret's current crisis was undeniable. Patricia made a decision without consulting Robert. She liquidated her personal retirement account, money that was legally hers alone, and drove to the hospital where Margaret was recovering. Margaret was surprised when Patricia Harrison appeared in her hospital room, looking nothing like the polished socialite she remembered. Patricia's expensive clothes had been replaced with simple jeans and a sweater. Her perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face showed the strain of recent events. "Mrs. Harrison?" Margaret said, confusion evident in her voice. "What are you doing here?" Patricia pulled a chair next to Margaret's bed, her hands trembling slightly. "I came to apologize and to try to make things right. I know what Robert did, firing you for being pregnant. I know about your medical bills and your baby in the NICU." Margaret stared at her former employer's wife in amazement. "How did you find out about all this?" "I hired someone to locate you after Robert told me the truth about why you left," Patricia said, her voice filled with shame. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. While I was hosting charity events pretending to care about pregnant women in need, my own husband was destroying the life of a pregnant woman who worked in our home." Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "This won't undo what happened, but it will cover your medical bills and give you time to recover without worrying about money." Margaret opened the envelope and gasped. Inside was a check for $100,000, more money than she had ever seen in her life. "I can't accept this," Margaret said, though her eyes filled with tears of relief. "It's too much." Patricia shook her head firmly. "It's not enough, but it's what I can do right now. My retirement account was the only money I had that Robert couldn't touch. Consider it payment for the injustice you suffered, and for the medical costs that stress contributed to causing." As Patricia prepared to leave, Margaret asked the question that had been haunting her. "Mrs. Harrison, why are you doing this now? What changed?" Patricia's smile was sad but genuine. "We lost everything, Margaret. Our house, our money, our position in society, all of it's gone. Going through this experience has taught me what it feels like to be vulnerable and desperate. I finally understand what Robert's business practices really meant for the people he targeted." Margaret watched Patricia leave, feeling a complex mixture of gratitude, vindication, and even sympathy. The money would indeed solve their immediate crisis, but more importantly, it represented an acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done to her family. That evening, David returned from visiting baby James to find Margaret holding the check and crying tears of relief. For the first time in months, they could focus on their son's recovery without the crushing weight of financial catastrophe. "There's something else," Margaret told David as they sat together in the hospital room. "Mrs. Harrison told me they lost everything. They're moving to an apartment in our neighborhood." David looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Karma," he said simply. "Sometimes the universe has its own way of balancing things out." Neither Margaret nor David could know that Robert Harrison's reckoning was far from over, and that the lessons he needed to learn about compassion and humility were just beginning. The man who had fired a pregnant woman without thought for her welfare was about to discover what it truly meant to depend on the kindness of others. 3 weeks after Patricia's visit to the hospital, Robert Harrison found himself in a situation he never could have imagined. He was standing in line at the unemployment office, wearing a wrinkled shirt and cheap pants purchased from a discount store. The man who had once owned multiple properties was now applying for government assistance to help pay rent on a cramped one-bedroom apartment. The apartment building was old and poorly maintained, with thin walls that let through every sound from neighboring units. Robert could hear babies crying, televisions blaring, and the constant noise of people living too close together with too little money. It was a harsh introduction to the reality that most people faced every day. Patricia had left Robert 2 days after giving Margaret the money. She couldn't reconcile staying with a man whose business practices had caused so much suffering, and Robert's continued lack of remorse had made the decision easier. She moved in with her sister in another state, taking only her personal belongings, and leaving Robert to face the consequences of his actions alone. Robert's first week in the new apartment was a nightmare of practical challenges he had never had to face. He didn't know how to operate the old washing machine in the building's basement, had never cooked a meal for himself, and was shocked by the cost of basic groceries when you couldn't afford to buy in bulk. The job search was even more humiliating. At 55, with a reputation for ruthless business practices and a recent bankruptcy, Robert discovered that very few employers were interested in hiring him. His management experience was overshadowed by news reports about his business failures and the methods he had used to build his wealth. One morning, while walking to another job interview, Robert saw a familiar figure pushing a stroller near the small park across from his apartment building. It took him a moment to recognize Margaret, looking healthy and happy as she walked with her baby. Next to her was a man Robert assumed was her husband, and they were laughing about something while their baby gurgled contentedly. Robert instinctively stepped behind a tree, not wanting to be seen. Watching Margaret with her family, he felt a complicated mixture of emotions he couldn't quite identify. There was shame, certainly, but also something that might have been envy. Despite everything they had been through, Margaret and her family looked genuinely happy. That afternoon, Robert's job interview went poorly. The manager of the small retail store seemed unimpressed with his credentials and openly skeptical about his motivations for seeking minimum wage work. "Why would someone with your background want to work in retail?" the manager asked, clearly suspicious. Robert struggled to answer honestly. "I need the income, and I'm learning that work is work, regardless of the setting." The manager's expression suggested he didn't believe Robert's newfound humility was genuine. "I'll call you if we decide to move forward," he said, though his tone made it clear no call would be coming. Walking home from another rejection, Robert stopped at a small convenience store to buy instant coffee, one of the few luxuries he could still afford. Behind the counter was a young woman with a name tag reading Sophia, and Robert realized with a start that she was his former maid. Sophia recognized him immediately, her expression shifting from professional friendliness to cold recognition. "Mr. Harrison," she said simply, making no effort to hide her disdain. Robert felt his face flush with embarrassment. The last time he had seen Sophia, he had been her employer, living in luxury while she cleaned his mansion. Now he was counting coins to buy cheap coffee while she worked a job that probably paid better than anything he could currently find. "Sophia," Robert said quietly, unsure what else to say. "How are you doing?" Sophia's smile was sharp and knowing. "I'm doing well, actually. After Mrs. Harrison had to let me go when you lost the house, I found work with a family that treats their employees with respect. Much better situation." The implicit criticism stung, but Robert knew he deserved it. He paid for his coffee and left without another word, Sophia's judgment following him out the door. That evening, Robert sat in his small apartment eating a meal of instant noodles and stale bread, reflecting on how completely his life had changed. The silence was broken by a knock on his door. When he opened it, he was shocked to find Margaret standing in the hallway, holding her baby. "Hello, Mr. Harrison," Margaret said, her voice calm but not unfriendly. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by." I heard from Mrs. Chen at the grocery store that you were living in the building. Robert stared at her, unable to process why the woman he had fired would voluntarily visit him. Margaret, What are you doing here? Margaret shifted her baby to her other arm, and Robert noticed how healthy and alert the child looked. I wanted to talk to you. May I come in? Robert stepped aside, acutely aware of how shabby his apartment must look compared to the mansion where Margaret had once worked for him. She sat in the one decent chair while Robert remained standing, too nervous to sit. Your wife came to see me in the hospital, Margaret began. She told me about what happened to your business and she gave me money to cover our medical bills. Robert nodded, unsurprised. Patricia's generosity had been one more source of conflict between them before she left. She made that decision on her own. Margaret studied Robert's face, seeing exhaustion and defeat where arrogance had once lived. I know you didn't support her decision, but I wanted you to know that her kindness saved my family from financial ruin. Robert felt compelled to respond, though the words came with difficulty. I'm glad the money helped. Your baby looks healthy. He is now, Margaret said, but the premature birth and NICU stay were partly caused by the stress of losing my job while pregnant. The doctors were clear about that connection. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. He had never considered that his business decisions might have real health consequences for the people affected. In his mind, employment decisions were purely economic, with no personal dimensions. I didn't know, Robert said quietly. I never thought about the health implications. Margaret's expression softened slightly. I know you didn't think about it, Mr. Harrison. That was the problem. To you, I was just a number on a payroll, not a person with a family and responsibilities. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Margaret's words settling between them. Finally, Margaret spoke again. I'm not here to make you feel worse than you already do. I can see that you're going through your own difficulties now. I came because I wanted to tell you something important. Robert looked up, curious despite his shame. Mrs. Chen at the grocery store is looking for someone to help with inventory and stocking. It's honest work, and she's a good person to work for. She believes in giving people second chances. Margaret paused, then added, I told her you might be interested. Robert stared at Margaret in amazement. After everything he had put her through, she was offering to help him find work. Why would you do that for me? Margaret stood to leave, settling her baby more comfortably in her arms. Because everyone deserves a chance to do better, Mr. Harrison, and because I've learned that carrying anger and resentment only hurts the person carrying it. As she reached the door, Margaret turned back one more time. The job pays minimum wage and requires hard work, but it's a start if you're genuinely ready to change how you treat people. After Margaret left, Robert sat alone in his apartment, staring at the business card she had left with Mrs. Chen's contact information. For the first time since his world had collapsed, he felt something that might have been hope, mixed with a profound understanding of how much he needed to change. The next morning, Robert Harrison walked into Chen's grocery store, not as the arrogant businessman who had once fired a pregnant woman without thought, but as a man who was finally beginning to understand the value of compassion and the true meaning of second chances. Margaret's act of kindness had completed the circle of karma, but more importantly, it had opened the door for Robert to become the person he should have been all along.